Take two. I'm here to talk to you today about the brain. I've made these handy dandy models to explain them to you. So, first we'll start with this one, and I'll start by telling you that the brain has two hemispheres. We have our left hemisphere, our right hemisphere, and we have a deep groove that goes right down the middle called the longitudinal fissure that separates the two. We also have our four lobes. We have our frontal lobe, which is right here in the front of our head. The frontal lobe is important for voluntary movement, expressive language, and managing higher level executive functions. Inside of our frontal area, we have our Broca's area. Broca's area is only on the left side of the brain. So, and this area is responsible for controlling the movement of the muscles that we use to speak. So our lips, tongue, larynx, things like that. We also have our motor cortex inside of our temporal lobe. Our motor cortex is involved in the planning, controlling, and execution of voluntary movements. Right back here we have in the purple, we have our parietal lobe. Our parietal lobe is primarily responsible for receiving and processing sensory input such as touch, pressure, heat, cold, things like that. Within our parietal lobe, we have our somatosensory cortex. And that has a lot of functions, including representation of the body, attention, the processing of painful stimuli, empathy, emotion, things like that. On either side of our brain, we have our temporal lobe in the green. So our temporal lobe is primarily involved in auditory perception, such as like hearing, and it also is home to this blue part, which would be our auditory cortex. Our auditory cortex is the part that processes auditory information, basic higher functions such as hearing and possible relation to language switching. Moving on, we have this light pink area back here. Don't know where my little thingy went, but that is the Wernicke's area. And the Wernicke's area is the region of the brain that is important for language development. Moving on, in the back here, this is the back, in the pink, we have our occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is primarily functioning with visual processing. It's associated with visuospatial processing, distance and depth and things like that, color determination, object or face recognition, things like that. In green here, we have our cerebellum. Cerebellum is involved in voluntary motor movement, balance, equilibrium, muscle tone. It's at the bottom of your head here, and it attaches to your spinal cord. So, or your brainstem, excuse me. So the brain can also be split up into three different parts, and those parts would be the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Your forebrain includes your cerebrum, your thalamus, and your hypothalamus, and these things help with problem solving and regulate autonomic and endocrine motor functions. Your midbrain, which is this little part right here, serves as motor movements of your eye, auditory and visual processing, so it all kind of works together. Your hindbrain includes the pons, medulla, and your cerebellum, and this all has to do with survival functions like breathing, respiratory rhythm, motor, sleep, things like that. Up here in the front, this would be the front, this is your front of your face, would be your prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is involved with like memory, attention, planning, problem solving, things like that. So real quick, right here we have you have the folds of your brain, and that's what this is to represent. And at the top of the fold you have your gyrus, and at the bottom fold, the sunken in part would be the sulcus. In green, lime green here, we have the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the communication between the right and the left hemisphere so that everything's working together. You have your thalamus. Your thalamus is mostly involved with regulation of consciousness and alertness, motor signals, things like that. Orange here, we have our hypothalamus. Its role is to regulate the temperature of the body as well as motivational behaviors like thirst or hunger, things like that. We also have our amygdala. Our amygdala has such a lot to do with our emotions, and it plays a role in processing of fear and things like that. I think I have a really big amygdala. This blue part right here, you can't see it because I kind of have a flag in front of it, but that is our hippocampus. Our hippocampus is embedded deep into our temporal lobe, which would be that green one on the side, and its major role is memory. You have your medulla. My medulla is right down here on the bottom in this bright pink here, and the medulla is responsible for maintaining your vital functions, so like your heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, things like that, and also involuntary reflexes like sneezing, coughing, vomiting, things like that. And then you have your pons, and your pons is responsible for sending signals or messages to several different areas of your brain, and it also plays a role in your sleep and dreaming. One more thing is just this whole top area where you would find like your lobes and stuff inside the brain is also called the cerebral cortex. Thanks.